Welcome back to another episode of the Kings Pulse podcast presented by the Kings Herald. My name is Brendan Nunez, and today we're continuing our off-season recaps / season previews for the other teams around the league and getting familiar with the competition, which I think is very important. And today is the Charlotte Hornets episode, and joining me is the co-host of the Buzz Beat podcast, a fellow Blue Wire podcast, and also does work for Sports Channel 8. Brian Geisinger. How you doing, Brian?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, thanks for joining me, man. It's always good to get some additional perspective from other people around the league. And typically what I start with, I know this is a very vague question, so kind of take it in whatever direction you'd like, but how do you feel like last year went for the Charlotte Hornets compared to relative expectations?
Yeah, that's actually I think a tough question to answer. I would put it this way. They ended up being kind of right around where I thought they were going to be before the season started. I thought they would be around 9th or 10th. I thought they would be explosive offensively. I thought they would be very bad defensively. And just stacking up the rest of the Eastern Conference, it would sort of look tough for them to actually, before the season started, last October, last September, last fall, it seemed tough for them to crack even into maybe the top half of the play-in, but even that seemed like it was going to be a little bit of a stretch. But then they got off to such a good start, and they were playing phenomenal basketball probably up until like the middle of February, and that's when things started to get a little wobbly. Some of the issues on defense really started to catch up with them. Guys missing games. And then, Gordon Hayward goes down for the second straight season and misses essentially the final third of the year or so. They really missed his production. They really missed his shooting, his playmaking. I mean, Hayward is far from a perfect player at this point, but he can score and facilitate from a bunch of different levels of the court. He can take advantage of mismatches. He can be sort of like a half-court stabilizer. That's something that's how we referred to him on BuzzBeat a lot, and they definitely missed that. So at that point of the season, if we're talking like late January, early February, I'm thinking maybe they could get to 5 or 6 and stay there, and maybe they'll actually avoid the play-in. And then, of course, as I sort of laid out, like the back third of the season was pretty bad, and then it just sort of culminated with the pretty terrible showing in the play-in game against Atlanta. And I think the fact that they changed coaches this offseason in pretty comically bad fashion, including some circumstance that were out of their control, to be clear, but speaks to the fact that internally they thought this team was not just a play-in team, but probably a playoff team. So I don't think it's a good idea to extend a coach and then fire him 9 months later because Trae Young lit you up in the play-in game. But that was the path that they went. So I think ultimately they kind of finished where a lot of people had them projected, maybe a little bit below. And I think they were clearly below where the franchise thought they would be, assuming they were probably, I guess, expecting some type of linear progression, like, you're playing the year before. I don't think they really upgraded the roster much in the offseason of 2021, but I think they just thought with the growth of some of the young guys that might push them safely into the playoffs. It didn't happen. And now they're staring down a pretty tough upcoming season after what has been a pretty brutal offseason in a lot of different ways for the franchise now.
Yeah, really what seems like a mess of an offseason. And to start with the coaching change, this felt very Sacramento Kings, or I guess Kangz to me, from another organization, I guess, is in a weird way nice to see, to know the Kings aren't the only ones. But let's just start with Borrego being fired, because I think this was a surprise, at least to me, and it seemed like a lot of people outside of Charlotte. How surprising was it to you as somebody that kept up with the team, and like, what were your impressions of Borrego as a coach? Because the team got better under him, but the talent got better as well, for what it's worth.
Yeah, it registered as a surprise, albeit I think a pretty low one for myself and everyone else on the Buzzbeat podcast. I think we talked about this a couple of months ago when the firing came down, but it was like, they won 43 games this past season. They were top 6, top 8 in the league in terms of offensive efficiency. I think you saw some of the young guys improve. Maybe not all of them, but there was sort of, I think, enough development that you could still technically point to player development, which is was one of the foundational elements of the Borrego tenure. You could still say, no, this is churning out some success, or there's some improvements that are happening here. But clearly, the mandate was to not just make the playoffs, but I do think it was the aesthetics of how it ended this season, with things sort of unraveling, and then again the play-in tournament not looking well. Now, I don't think that it is wise to use. Context is important. Missing Gordon Hayward for the backstretch of the season was tough. With a roster that already was like decent in terms of talent, but not amazing. And then you really shouldn't, if it did come down to just how bad the play-in game looked for the second year in a row. I just don't think with a roster that's developing, you can use just like a weird 1-game sample to sort of determine, like, the guy's either your guy or you're not, or he's not. And again, they had extended Borrego in last September, and 9 months later he was gone. Now, I do think there were certainly some rumblings that the team had started to maybe tune him out a little bit. And as someone that's just not in the locker room, I mean, I watch every game, but I live in Raleigh, not Charlotte. I'm not around the team all that much. So I can't, that is something I cannot speak to. I do think, in terms of what the effort and the communication level looked like defensively, I think maybe there's a chance there's some credence to that, but also they just had bad defensive personnel and they're a young team. So it's like, it's sort of tough to weigh that, in my opinion. And how much of the blame does James Borrego get for that? I'm not sure. And then the last thing I would say with relation to JB, I think he did a lot of positive stuff, especially given that the franchise changed multiple times throughout his tenure. When he first shows up, it feels like a million years ago, but Kemba Walker's still there in 2018. And the mandate is get to the playoffs. They don't get to the playoffs. They trade Kemba that offseason. Terry Rozier comes in. And then it is, we're going to rebuild. Well, then it's a 1-year rebuild, basically. They essentially tank for one season. They draft LaMelo Ball, and then a week later, they stretch Nick Batum so they can acquire Gordon Hayward. And yet, in each of the last 2 seasons, when there have been chances to sort of like upgrade the roster via trade, while I, perhaps narrow-mindedly, have preferred that the team was a little more guarded with its picks and its young players, it was not sort of like willing to dump a bunch of stuff to trade for a Miles Turner or to trade for center X or center Y. It was tough that the franchise clearly was mandating to win now, and yet at the same time was also trying to think about, well, what does this look like X number of years from now around LaMelo, right? And making sure you keep all of your young players and your picks intact. And like, again, generally speaking, that's good practice. It's just tough to do both of those things at the same time. I think in recent years, a team like Boston has been able to get away with that. New Orleans is going to be able to do that now, just because they have these surplus of picks from trades, and they're also good enough so they can win and still continue to replenish the roster through the draft. And I just think that was a tough ask, both in terms of like roster construction and sort of internally what the goals and projections were for the team. So a little bit frustrating in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole overreacting to potentially overreacting to a 1-game sample size of the play-in. And I know it was a similar situation the year prior where that play-in situation didn't exactly go well for them either. I just rewatched that game the other day when I was watching Kevin Huerter tape, and it was a lot worse than I even remembered, to be honest.
It was bad.
It was really pretty
bad.
Like, it was not very close at the end of that game.
PJ Washington is really like the one guy that kind of showed up for them that game. It it was a pretty poor showing. I mean, look, Trae Young is the exact kind of player that is built to just like shred the Hornets. Just an awful pick and roll defensive team the last however many years. And so, they tried to trap him at the start of that game, but there were just the rotations and the timing. None of it was there. And it turned into a hot mess really, really, really quickly. So, yeah, disappointing to say the least.
Yeah, and then after Borrego, there's a interesting situation for sure where Atkinson gets hired on June 10th. 8 days later, he pretty much decides never mind. And then I believe 6 days after that, Steve Clifford is brought on board. Clifford was a guy that was also considered in Sacramento's coaching search and made it towards the later rounds of that consideration as well. What's the thought about Clifford coming back? He's somebody I actually really liked for Sacramento, considering they're a team that I think is trying to make it happen right now. I think in years prior in Charlotte and Orlando, he's gotten the most out of what I thought wasn't maybe the most talented roster, specifically on the defensive end. Like when you're talking about Vucevic and DJ Augustine starting for you, and you have a top 10 defense, I believe it is, like that's really impressive, even if you do count in Aaron Gordon and Jonathan Isaac. Like I think that there is a lot of value in that. But what's the thought with Clifford going into this year?
Yeah, welcome back to Charlotte, Steve Clifford. It was, that entire 8-day period was just kind of nuts because it's like everyone has just gotten done recording all of their what are the Hornets going to look like under Kenny Atkinson podcast. Everyone's got done writing their things and tweeting out their clip threads and, oh, this is how they're going to play defense. They're going to drop and they got the player development coach in, and then all of a sudden he just Shams or the Woj tweet hits your phone that it's not happening. And I did think they might try to reopen things up with Mike D'Antoni or maybe some of the other sort of like coach or some of the other candidates that they decided not to get. I mean, some of those guys got gobbled up. Darvin Ham ended up with the Lakers, but it is probably tough to then call to the guys that you just told we don't think you're good enough, and then to a week later call those guys back and say, hey, sorry about that. So I do think that they were looking for something comfortable, something safe, probably something cheap. And Steve Clifford was there. I mean, like they've kept some of the coaching staff, right? Like it's not a complete switchover of the assistants and what it's going to look like in Greensboro with the Swarm, the G League affiliate this year. There were some murmurs that like maybe the way the franchise was asking for the coaching staff to be put in place, like maybe that was causing Kenny Atkinson to feel a little uneasy. But if that's the case, if that is in fact the case, it didn't seem to be an issue with Steve Clifford. I like Steve Clifford. I think overall he's like a pretty good NBA coach. Is he like a top 10 coach in the league? Nah, probably not. But is he like a solid coach that does a nice job building defenses? Has some player development successes underneath his belt as a head coach. I think Kemba Walker in Charlotte comes to mind pretty quickly. And with Clifford, like kind of what things are going to look like. They're just going to try to like nail the small stuff. They'll improve the defense. I think. I mean, they kind of have to because they've just been so bad. And then you draft a guy like Mark Williams, who I covered at Duke. Now he's there. So in theory, you have the ability to guard pick and roll differently when Williams is in the game, assuming he's up to speed. But I'm sorry, I'm getting off track a little bit here. Back to Clifford. Like I think ultimately like it's a mostly fine hire. It's kind of wild too because it's 4 years after he's been gone and he's back. And now the roster has completely turned over since then, as has the front office too. But it's just crazy that he's back this quickly. And then the way that it unfolded, it seems sort of like they couldn't land the Atkinson decision or the Atkinson hire. And some of that is on Kenny Atkinson. Like, he chose to stick at Golden State, and a year from now he'll have his pick in terms of head coaching opportunities, I'm sure. But Clifford's solid. They're going to defensive rebound. They're going to do a better job protecting the paint. and hopefully they can find some ways to sort of like orient this offense around LaMelo Ball and scheme up some ways to get a little bit more rim pressure. Because I do think that's going to be a pretty sizable concern for this team on the offensive side of the floor this year. But ultimately, I think Clifford was fine. It's a fine hire, but certainly like not kind of like what you were, just not what you were hoping for or what you were expecting. And at the end of the day, you probably wish you had just kept James Borrego for another season.
Yeah, did Borrego get picked up anywhere yet?
I don't think so yet. I do know he sold his house in Charlotte recently, so
Gotcha.
I don't think he's sticking around for too long. I don't think so, but like that could also be he certainly could get picked up, right? Like he comes from the Spurs family. There's like 10 different guys that he was an assistant coach with in San Antonio that are head coaches in various places around the league. So I'm sure at some point in time he's going to get another look because he's young, and I think he did some good things as a head coach. But he'll probably have to take a cushy assistant job for a year or two somewhere, and good for him. Like I think James Borrego is a good coach, and I actually really liked offensively. Like I really liked the system they ran. I thought they squeezed more juice out of sort of like than what they actually had often. Not a perfect coach. There were certainly issues with the defense underneath him. There were, I think, at times questions with his rotation patterns, but for the most part, I think he does a lot of good stuff offensively as a head coach, and I'll be curious to see eventually where he does land.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It wouldn't surprise me to see that happen. I think there was just a picture the other day of him, Mike Brown, and Greg Popovich all witnessing some European teams practice while everybody was over there for Eurobasket going on.
Very cool.
Your point of view of that I wouldn't have considered of having to recall coaches that you just said didn't get the job to pitch it again. That is tough. I wouldn't have considered that. I could see how that puts you in a pretty shit situation. And in between, like Atkins says, never mind, and then the draft is like right after.
Yeah. They did the draft without a head coach. There was one other team that did that too. I don't remember. I'm blanking on who it was. I think it was Utah that did the draft without a head coach as well. But yeah, no head coach in place during the draft night. It's crazy.
So can you walk me through draft night? Because draft night seemed ridiculous. Well, I'm there trying to figure out. I mean, I was very focused on Sacramento's point of view, and they were high up in the draft, so it calmed down a little for me later. And then I was trying to figure out, like, what is this deal? Like, I was having so much trouble figuring out who got what, and the reporting of the details didn't come out till later. They needed a center. That seemed obvious to me, and they end up getting a center, but it wasn't the one they originally drafted at 13, which was Jalen Duren. It ends up being Mark Williams later. Can you kind of walk me through that night?
It was, man. It was it was confusing, to say the least. And the Hornets went into the draft night with 2 top 15 picks. Not great picks, 13 and 15, but ones that you felt pretty good about them being able to kind of do some damage with, right? Like not being able to, unlikely that they're going to like be able to package those picks and move up. And ultimately, I don't think that's like good draft philosophy to begin with. But you're thinking like they've got 2 late lottery picks. Like they should be able to get a starter out of with one of these picks. You know what I mean? Maybe, or maybe not next season, but you do a good job with one of these 2 picks, and maybe both of them pop, but most likely it's going to be one of them that can be like a piece for them going forward. They have for years been looking to get like a center, right? Even before LaMelo got here, but especially when LaMelo got here, they wanted to find someone that could be a pick and roll partner for him, right? And then they also wanted a center that could close off the paint and protect the rim, and give them a guy that could do more traditional, conservative, 2 feet in the paint or 1 foot in the paint style drop or play to the level pick and roll defense, as opposed to the last couple of years where they've played a ton of zone. They've switched a lot. They've trapped. It's been kind of a hodgepodge and a bit of a mess, to say the least. So, you thought they were going to go Williams. You had a good feeling was going to be there at 13 or 15. And I like Mark Williams as a prospect. I did. I did like Jalen Duren better. I think of him as someone that has a little more upside. He's younger. He's a little bit more comfortable on the short roll and in space. Athletically, he's special. Now he's not as big as Williams, but I just like the defensive upside of Duren, and I think both of those guys are going to play in the NBA for a long time. But I just I think Detroit got a really good young player with Jalen Duren. So they have 13 picks, 13 and 15. In some way, shape, or form, I'm thinking they're going to use these 2 picks, and they're going to get a center with one, and they're going to get a wing with the other. And I think that's like ultimately, like from my end, I'd rather them just draft 2 wings. You know what I mean? That's my thought. Just like get the upside wings in the door. But when Jalen Duren fell to 13, that's a guy that I probably had top 7 or top 8 in the draft. I was very excited. I thought he would have made a wonderful pick and roll partner to grow with next to LaMelo. And then very quickly after the pick happens, minutes later, kind of all hell breaks loose. There are right around the same time, I think Woj had a tweet that the Pistons, were going to acquire Duren at 13 via a trade. And then right around then, Shams had a tweet saying the Hornets were going to trade Duren to the Knicks. So it got very confusing. But ultimately, it ended up being like a 3-team deal with New York and Detroit. Duren gets routed to Detroit. Kemba through New York gets salary dumped to Detroit, or through New York gets salary dumped to Detroit. New York picks up 2 first-round picks. The Hornets pick up a 2023 first-round pick from New York, which is actually Denver's pick, so not that good of a pick. And then they also grabbed 4 second-round picks. 3 of them will be next season. I doubt they're going to keep all of those. My guess will be they'll use one in a trade at some point in time, or Michael Jordan will sell one for money, which is something that they haven't done in a long time, but is like an MJ as owner 1.0 tactic that we could see sooner rather than later. Would not surprise me. And then they draft Mark Williams at 15. And it was just a strange and kind of crazy period of time. I think there were a lot of good wings they passed up on. I mean, seeing Tari Eason go to Houston at 17, that's a guy that I would have loved for them to have taken at 13. To think they could have gotten Jalen Duren and Tari Eason at 13 and 15 in this draft, or they could have gotten Jalen Duren in AJ Griffin, or they could have drafted Mark Williams at 13 and gotten Griffin or Eason at 15. I mean, there's so many guys. Blake Wesley's another guy. I think they could have really would have been a nice guy to get in the door. Same with Malachi Branham. Both those guys ended up going to the Spurs in the 20s. But ultimately, they essentially, at the end of all of this, they essentially sold the rights to the number 13 pick, essentially. Do you know what I mean? And that
real weird asset management, I gotta say.
It's not, I mean, it's bad. Like, it's just bad. They sold it so they could keep a little bit of space off the books, in theory, thinking they were probably gonna maybe max out Miles Bridges in a couple of days. And then that goes to then that thing that takes a very, very dark turn for reasons that aren't just basketball related, obviously, with days later, right? And so, but ultimately, I think they were trying to save the $4 to $5 million salary slot that would come with the 13th pick, right? And they definitely tried to, so they could use that space to go, you offer Bridges more money or whatever. And they tried to frame it as, oh, we traded this pick and we picked up all these draft assets. But the stuff that they got in return, again, the 2023 first round pick that they got from New York, which is Denver's pick, like, dude, that could be like the 30th pick in the draft. Like they got a second round pick from Utah in the deal, I believe. And it's like that too came via New York. And those 2 picks, like the Denver first round pick and the Utah second round pick, those could be like 4 draft slots apart from one another, So it's not, I mean, who knows? Maybe Jamal Murray and Michael Porter Jr. aren't fully recovered and the Nuggets aren't as good as they're projected to be. I think they're going to be awesome this year. but that's going to be like the 28th pick in the draft. Like it's not a great draft asset. So you used a late lottery pick to add a crappy first round pick and some other draft fodder, just like a bunch of second round picks. And it's just not a good use. And for of draft assets, of picks, and for a team that's trying to build this up around LaMelo and some of the other young guys that are in the facility, it's pretty irresponsible in my opinion. And then just the way the offseason is unfolded, it's like they haven't signed anybody. Like they have 13 guys on the roster currently.
I thought I was crazy. I was like, dude, I have to be forgetting someone or something.
They have 13 guys. I do think they'll use one that 13 does not include Bryce McGowan, so they ended up drafting at 40th in the second round. They traded up in the second round to get him. I actually thought that was a pretty good pick. Like I like Mark Williams a lot as a prospect, but I just it is not a knock on Williams. I think he's going to be good for them for a long time, but it's just you go into the night expecting to get X amount of value out of the draft, and they got way less. And yeah, I do think they'll use one of those extra roster spots to sign a veteran point guard. It could be Kemba Walker. Like it could be him. Maybe it's Dennis Schroeder. There are not a lot of like great names at this point floating around, but they need someone else that can dribble the basketball, because right now your backup point guard minutes are going to be Terry Rozier or James Bouknight. And Rozier's your starting two guard. So like they're going to have to use one of those spots on that. And then I suppose they're keeping one of those other spots available for, I don't know what the hell's going to happen with Miles Bridges, man. Like, I just don't, I do know that there was there was an update earlier this week on his court case. I think there's, maybe by the middle of September, we'll have more of an idea, but like, I'm going to be honest, man, like, I don't like talking about Miles Bridges as a basketball player, right? Yeah. And I don't really want to see him in a Hornets uniform again. For those who are unfamiliar, Google the details. It's pretty horrific what occurred with him and his family this offseason. So, I don't know. This was an offseason that really, really was kind of a disaster. Even though I think they drafted two good players. Like I think Williams and McGowan's are good. McGowan's is going to be a two-way guy for them this year. I suppose they could convert him to a full-time contract or whatever and have him be one of the 15 guys. But for now, he's set to be a two-way guy for them. So. And then again, they signed no one in free agency. So strange offseason. They did not improve the roster very much. And again, I just mentioned I don't like talking about Bridges as like a player, because it ultimately, like, it doesn't, what's happening with the Hornets next season, like, doesn't actually matter. They're a mediocre basketball team, but like, he was really coming into his own as an impressive like young player in the league, and they are going to, assuming he's not playing next season, they're gonna have to try to find other ways to generate offense and generate rim pressure, because that was what he did on a big time basis for them really the last like 1.5 seasons.
Yeah. Talking about that sort of stuff, I think, is what surprised me the most. Just kind of getting into all of this in sports media and having to talk about different tough scenarios like that. And the Bridges one is just some of the most disgusting behavior. But, I think that we are kind of forced to talk about it from the organization's point of view as well. And it does put them in a pretty tough situation here as well. And also, like, in preparation for this, I'm trying to lay out their roster and their moves this offseason, and I swear I thought, I was like, I must be missing something. They really did nothing, and I just don't see how this team is better.
They're not. I mean, they're not.
Like, is there any
they're not better?
Is there any, what are the optimists? Like, is it like LaMelo outlier growth or something?
Yeah, I think LaMelo makes look, he just turned 21. He's awesome, right? He's super good. But like, I'm sure he's still getting better, and I think he's going to be awesome for them next season. Even though I do think because they're going to ask him to do even more in terms of shot creation, that could also like affect him adversely in certain ways too. But he's incredible. So yeah, the reasons for growth, optimisms for growth would be uh and just in terms of like if we're just focusing on next season, we're not thinking like building this thing up long term or intermediate term around LaMelo. If we're just focusing on the 22-23 season, it would be LaMelo outlier growth, or just like, you know, something beyond sort of like what you could like reasonably project for him next season. It's that Williams is ready to play from day one, and all of a sudden he can start at center, and you don't have to play Mason Plumlee, and you could just have your center rotation be, you know, some combination of Mark Williams, PJ Washington, and you know, maybe Kai Jones. I think the other thought would be like Kai Jones or JT Thor take a jump, right? And as second year guys. I thought Thor played well as a rookie. I really liked him as a prospect coming out of Auburn. He did not have the good summer league in Vegas. Kai Jones is
I really
dripping
like
with
both those guys.
yeah, I do.
Super
I
raw
do too.
prospects.
And Kai Jones is dripping with talent, like, and is like is an outlier athlete for a guy that length and size, in terms of flexibility, in terms of his vertical pop, but doesn't really have a home defensively. And offensively, it's tough when he's like the four. Like, he really needs to play a small ball five for them. That's like really when he's at his best. But then what are you doing defensively if that's the case? You know, like it just gets tough. He's not a guy that you can rely on to like anchor a defense, but I also don't think he can be your four guy and have the guy that is, you know, the back line low man, right? And is giving you rim protection, is in the right places at the right time as a help guy. But he's talented. I think that would be the hope. Part of this is also like Book Knight makes a jump. PJ Washington makes a jump. Like, they have enough young guys that I think you could say like, well, if over half of these guys make some jump, and for some of them it's more meaningful than others, LaMelo specifically, and then I don't know, maybe you use Plumlee and Oubre, which are two tradable contracts, and you use some of your draft capital to trade for, you know, I don't know, man, Miles Turner, I don't know, a wing, like I don't really know. Those would be the thoughts. But to your point, like about what they also didn't do this offseason, the one thing they did, I guess, is they brought back Cody Martin, $32 million over 4 years. I think that's a pretty fine contract. Like, he earned it. Good for him. It's a pretty like unglamorous path from 5 years in college basketball to second round pick, starting in Mocksville, North Carolina, which is not the nicest town in the world, to 5 years in college basketball, to second round pick, to earning a 4-year, $32 million contract is impressive. But like, no extension for PJ Washington, right? Who was also drafted in was a lottery pick in 2019. Like, you extended your second round pick from that year and not the lottery guy. I thought maybe there was a chance they'd look to lock into some cost certainty with PJ, and maybe they did. There was no reporting of that, but maybe that's something they tried to do, in PJ, and his representation balked at that. But I kind of thought maybe they would try to lock him into a number, and maybe
What
try to
sort
get
of number do you think is reasonable for PJ? I think he is somebody that, you know, Holmes has been linked to the Charlotte a lot. And anytime I look at it from the Kings point of view, PJ is a guy that's intriguing, but that's only like if the financial situation is going to be tough for Charlotte down the line.
Yeah.
What do you think is a reasonable number for him?
Well, and also, like, let me preface this by saying, like, I am pretty high on PJ. I think I am mindful of his limitations. He's not a guy that creates his own shot. He's not a guy that, you know, he really needs to play off of advantage, is what I'm saying. And like, that was one of the things, that's partly why he's so good with LaMelo. But he's an incredibly versatile two-way player. Like, I think of him as like a high level role player that can be on the court in the playoffs. You know what I mean? Like, like, I think eventually he's the kind of guy that could be on the floor in leverage minutes of a playoff game. And he can guard a couple of different positions. So I think for PJ, as far as money goes, I mean, like, I'm sure the team probably thinks of him more as like a 10, 12 guy, 10, 12 million a year. And I think that's like not even like a totally unreasonable number. But I think PJ, in terms of like his value, is worth, like, I think he's probably closer to like 15, 18 a year. But to be clear, like, I am on the high end in terms of PJ. But this guy, he's 7'3" wingspan. He can protect the rim some. Like, he can anchor a defense when you play zone. He can switch and guard a bunch of different positions. And like, he had some excellent switch possessions against, like, I'm talking about like high level one-on-one offensive players: Trae Young, Chris Middleton, Giannis, DeMar DeRozan. Like, he switched out and handled those guys at different times this season. He's a big time above the break 3-point shooter, and he was not very good from the corners this year, but his first 2 seasons he was cash from the corners. But high volume, high efficiency, above the break 3-point shooter, a dynamic pick and pop player who at times has shown the ability to put the ball on the deck and attack closeouts, make plays, and can pick and roll, can pick and pop, can short roll and pass out of the short roll. Like, he's a damn good player. I actually think he and, like, I mean, I don't want the Hornets to trade him to Sacramento, but like, he and Sabonis would be like an awesome front court combo. They would pair, I think, very nicely together in a lot of different ways. So that's probably where I would put PJ, somewhere in the 15 to 18 year range. I think it would have been awesome if they could have signed him to a, $60 million over 4-year deal. You know what I mean? This offseason, that kind of like extension. I would be comfortable going above that, but ultimately I have no idea where a lot of the league sees him or where the team sees him, because there were just like those negotiations did not happen in public at all this offseason, if there were any.
Yeah, it's crazy because like 10 million weirdly sounds so low now. You know, in today's NBA, like, for a guy that I think is a starter in the league, like has been a starter in the league and probably could continue to get better. He's still young. Just, this is about to be his 4th year, I believe. And just, especially from the Kings point of view, it's so valuable. I've come to realize like how often I'm looking for these perfect complementary players, right?
Mm-hmm.
And PJ, just for all the reasons you laid out, absolutely screams that. And specifically looking for a forward that can shoot and also be somewhat of a difference maker on the defensive end, give you some bits and pieces of rim protection along with the switching. Like, absolutely, I've always thought that PJ was a dream. This is where I try to pitch you. Is there a potential Richaun Holmes trade or even Harrison Barnes trade? Every person that I'm having on this pod, is there any Harrison Barnes or Richaun Holmes interest?
I mean, I would let me start first with Holmes. I thought Holmes is a guy that Charlotte should have tried to have signed in 2021, like last offseason. I think they were pretty busy in 2021, and I think they had some good and some bad that offseason. I mean, the Plumlee trade, which allowed them to also move up in the second round and draft Thor. Like, I like that, but that also took away some of their cap space, and then probably maybe that pushed them out of the Holmes sweepstakes. I didn't really like them trading Devontae Graham, but it ultimately led to a first-round pick, the pick that became Mark Williams, 15 in the draft this year. And Devontae was not that great for the Pelicans this year either. I don't even really know how much a part of the long-term picture he'll be there. We'll see. So I don't think, like, there might be a Holmes trade, but it's centered on Williams is not ready, and you think Holmes could be a 1 to 2 year stopgap, or he has 2 years left on his deal. Is that how many it is for Holmes? I think
Might be
pretty sure
3. It's 2 and then a player option on the 3rd.
Okay, and that player option. Okay, yeah, for 3 seasons from now. I mean, probably a good chance he wants to pick that up, honestly. So, but maybe it depends on how he's playing in 2 years. I think there's a potential for it because they looked really good running pick and roll this past season, like when Montrezl Harrell was in there. I don't think the numbers were great, but if you watch them play, like the LaMelo, Montrezl Harrell empty corner pick and roll was pretty damn good for them. And opened up a lot of stuff, even if those guys didn't score out of the pick and roll, like the direct pick and roll screen. So I think it does exist because I think there's a need to find someone that can like really roll and short roll and hit floaters, because Plumlee like can't do that stuff. A lot of times LaMelo Plumlee pick and rolls just like die on the vine. Like Plumlee catches in space in the middle of the court on a short roll. And I mean, he can dribble and do stuff with the ball, but he just can't score it. And so teams can just challenge him to shoot a floater or foul him. And all of a sudden the possession is just like, it's toast. Like it's just not nearly as valuable. Charlotte has lots of stuff to trade. I wouldn't be in the market for this deal, to be clear. Like I would say thanks, but no thanks. We're going to build this up around Mark Williams. We're trying to develop Kai Jones. We want him to have some center minutes. It's important for us to have PJ to keep playing some center minutes. I think they're going to need to do that. Even with all these different guys that have to play center, I just think they've got to be able to play PJ some there to close halves, to close games, because they need him for 5 out offense. Like that, he's the guy that they play at the 5 to get 5 out. But yeah, I mean, I think there are really easy deals you could do that would be, Plumlee's expiring contract or Kelly Oubre's expiring contract,
Oubre's the one that stands out to me.
Some draft capital, right? Like that would be that's probably the deal that it's going to cost the Hornets. I don't know, protected first, probably, or 2 seconds. I don't know what, like, I'm not sure where Holmes's value is, but I think it's something like those are probably what it looks like. Barnes is a guy that I think they could absolutely be in the market for. It's a good number he's on. I think the Hornets have salaries they could use to swing that deal. Some combination of Oubre, Plumlee, like something in those, and it sends draft capital to Sacramento. But like, I'm not sure if that's also, like, I could be messing up this proposition from Sac's point of view. Like, they're probably looking for guys that can help them win this season. And I don't think like Plumlee and Oubre are those players, I think it would be pretty foolish to include PJ in either of these types of transactions. Barnes is a good player, but he's an expiring contract and he doesn't help your rim pressure issues at all offensively, right? At least I don't think I'm not sure what Barnes is like rim numbers are, but I'm guessing a lot of what he gets at the rim comes on transition and cuts and putbacks. Like it's not like he's like running pick and roll and getting to the rim or whatever.
Maybe for the first 2 weeks of the season, and that's about it.
Yeah, that's like I think Charlotte has a lot of guys like that have that kind of profile on offense. I like Harrison. Like, I think Barnes is a good player. I think that's like a nice trade asset if Sacramento wants to go that route. And I mean, I think Barnes could also help a winner, whether it's Sacramento or if they ship him out somewhere this season. Like, I think both those, I think those guys absolutely have like positive trade value for Sacramento. I'm just not sure there's a deal to be made here for Charlotte, in part because, like, I don't know what their plan is for this season, man. Like, I don't know if Charlotte wants to make, I mean, I'm sure they want to make the playoffs, but like on paper, they're not ready for it. And this is a 2023 draft that is loaded with guys, has a ton of wings, and has some guys at the top, center and Victor Wembanyama, and a guard prospect in Scoot Henderson that everyone who's listening to this knows about. And those guys would be huge additions for Charlotte. So, I mean, I think they should be looking at like a 1 year sort of like pause and reset. And let's go get a top 5 pick or a top 3 pick and try to get one of these guys. But who knows? Maybe they're going to be feeling the need to really like put the pedal down and win now. That would be the likely MO for an MJ team, for a Steve Clifford team. But we'll just see. Like, if injuries pile up, if the record's not good enough, I'll be curious to see how they behave. So I think deals exist. I just don't think they make a ton of sense really for either side, even if like the numbers line up, and even if guys like Barnes and Holmes conceivably could help Charlotte in certain ways, Holmes especially, I think.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. I think, PJ would be like the hopeful gem from Sacramento's point of view, but I totally understand why Charlotte's perspective wouldn't be interested. And then if there was something around Kelly Oubre, like I could see it. And I think when it comes to HB being involved in that, I think it would just have to be that they know that HB's walking at the end of the year for nothing, and they think that they could keep Oubre around. Like, and even then, I don't feel great about it. Like, I would talk myself into, well, what if this year went really well in the play in and maybe steal a game in the first round or something, then can you repitch this to Harrison Barnes?
Yeah.
It's definitely a little bit of a tricky situation there. And
Oubre stinks, man. Like he's not he's like not good. I mean, he has he has the ability to catch fire and be like at times be like a pretty special 3-point shooter like 5 nights out of the year when he's just feeling it, and he can make some tough shots, and you can like run actions for him. Like you can put him in as a movement shooter. You can use him like that. But like his assignment defense is awful. And man, it's just like the advantage just stops every time he gets the ball on offense unless he shoots it. You know, like he's just the decision making, the processing is just not that good. So certain nights it's really fun to have him because he can be a demon in transition and he can get really hot and hit a bunch of threes. But I just don't like he should be a bit rotation guy, not a guy who's like in your top. If you're a winning team, he's not in your top 7 or 8. You know, like it's just that he's not like that. He's not that kind of contributor.
That makes sense. That definitely makes sense. And I guess I partially look at it because the Kings' backup 3 right now might be Kevin Huerter, their starting 2 guard, which sounds similar to your Terry Rozier situation. And then after that, you're talking like KZ Okpala, Kent Bazemore, Terrence Davis. So they're pretty thin at that position right now specifically. Maybe that's why I look that way a little bit, but totally understand where you're coming from. And it's good to get your perspective on on Kelly, because he seemed to be a little bit polarizing, and maybe it's just like good stretches here and there that people highlight and hold on to for a little bit too long. But the last couple things I got for you, Brian, before I get you out of here, sorry we're running a little bit longer.
No, all good. I've been rambling, so apologies from my end here.
Makes it easy on my end, man. No worries at all. I like to get outsiders' perspective on the Kings, and I know this can be tough for some people if I mean, especially Eastern Conference. People that cover teams in the Eastern Conference, like not expecting everybody to keep up with everybody super close, but just 2 questions for you on your perspective on the Kings. Like, what do you make of a Fox and Sabonis pairing? How good do you think that duo can be?
I'm intrigued by it. I like both those guys individually quite a bit. I think maybe even a little bit more, sort of like the general consensus. I mean, this is a huge year for Fox. I think, at least just from my own perspective. I like the way those guys complement one another in certain ways. It just feels like there's so much you can kind of do with Sabonis because his ability to be a handoff guy, to be a screener, to be a short roll guy. He kills the Hornets every time they play. He just absolutely bullies them. So I like that combination, and I actually kind of like some of the pieces they have around it. Like I'm a big Malik Monk guy. Like I have been since he was at Kentucky. I can't
believe I didn't ask you about Monk. How'd that go over my head?
It's cool to see he and Fox reunited. Those guys are buddies going back to their days in Lexington together. I like Monk a lot. I'm happy for him that he bet on himself with LA this past offseason and turned it into a nice little contract with the Kings. So I hope it goes really, really well for Malik. I'll always pull for that guy because he had kind of an up and down first 4 years in the league, but he really started to put it together his last season in Charlotte. He can be a little up and down defensively, but offensively, he's a guy that can really do a lot of different stuff and can get to the rim, can get a piece of the paint with a dribble, can pass, can throw a bunch of different kinds of passes, can get hot as a shooter, can shoot off movement. So I think I kind of like him in this mix, and I kind of like just what Sack has in the backcourt, like Fox and Mitchell, Herter, Monk. That's cool. I'm excited to see Keegan Murray like outside of summer league. I don't know where you came down on this. I mean, I would have gone Ivy at 4. I like really like Jaden Ivey as a prospect. Ivy. But Murray is awesome too. Like he's a good player. I just would have felt better drafting him at like 8 or 9, and not 4 when Jaden Ivey is hanging right there. So, but I'm fascinated to see. I think the West is tough. If this team was in the Eastern Conference, I feel like they're easily in the play-in or pretty safely in the play-in, and I don't know. We'll see how it goes in the West. There's stating the obvious, but it's crazy how many good teams are out there.
Yes, and that's my next question for you, Brian. I think that this is the fifth. I think this is the fifth team I've done so far, which I got to speed up the pace a little bit if I'm going to finish this by the start of the regular season. But I believe we're 2-2 at this point on this question. Do you think that the Kings break their 16-year playoff drought? And playoffs is not play in; they would have to win the play in.
Right. um. I'm gonna
I
say
think
I'll
it's
say
what you pointed out that the West is really tough. Like it looks like
yeah.
a playoff team.
Apologies, but no, I don't see it. I mean, I think they're in the play in probably, just because there's such a difference between the teams that are going for it in the West and not going for it. Like it's not going to be Houston, it's not going to be Utah, it's not going to be uh, San Antonio, but then it's just like a bloodbath after that. So I'll say no. I hope I'm wrong though, because man, they just like that's a long time to not be in the playoffs. And as someone that covers one of the other more underwhelming franchises in the NBA with the Hornets, I root for small markets. I want them to do well, and I'm hopeful for the Kings. I don't know. It feels like it's going to take them exceeding expectations and one or two teams falling below that in the West for them to really have a shot.
I absolutely agree. For what it's worth, I am definitely a no there. I absolutely agree with what you said that it's going to take one or two teams above them just like crumbling and something to go horribly wrong for whatever reason, which there's at least like one team every year, it feels like.
Yeah,
So you never
it could
know.
happen. Yeah, it totally could. It totally could.
It also could be the Kings for what it's worth.
Yeah. Let's hope not, but yeah, I suppose that possibility does exist.
Yeah. So, all right, Brian, that's all that I have for you. Again, Brian Geisinger, who covers the Charlotte Hornets on the BuzzBeat podcast, also part of Blue Wire. Any final thoughts, Brian, before I get you out of here?
Nope. Thanks for having me on. And yeah, if you guys are curious about the Hornets at all, just make sure to check out the BuzzBeat podcast. It's in all of your like you said, it's on all of it's on Blue Wire. It's on all. You can find it in any podcast app. And we'll be doing 1 to 2 episodes per week throughout the season. So if you're curious about LaMelo and the Hornets, please make sure to check that out.
Absolutely. Can't say enough about the work you guys do. Did a lot of listening to that in preparation for this, and you guys do great coverage for sure. And your own Twitter as well. I'm a big I like the nuances of the game, and clearly you're the same and breaking down a lot of film, and that's at BGEIS_bird. So definitely be sure to give Brian a follow there. And thanks everybody for listening to this episode. Also take a look at the King's Herald. I just put out a piece on Nemias Keita's couple games of Portugal. There will be a couple more breakdowns coming down from Eurobasket and anything else Sacramento Kings related, obviously, from myself and all the other guys and gals there. So take a look at the King's Herald and their Patreon to support local independent Kings coverage. And if you enjoy this episode of the King's Pulse podcast, please follow, rate, and review, and hear from us again in the next couple.